So fundraising. Want to just talk a little bit about how you raise money and also how the climate is affecting that, if you're seeing anything yet. And I guess in particular, if you want to talk about as a early stage organization, how to avoid the temptation of going after money that isn't sort of central to the work that you're doing. Sort of how do you stomach passing on opportunities and doing what Lara's saying about saying no to something?
Okay, funding and how we do fundraising. Our funding comes all from private sources. There is a chunk of federal government money for domestic violence and sexual assault, and we don't have that. We sort of half-heartedly applied for it a couple times, but anyway, we have, so it's all foundations or corporate foundations and private individuals. We started out fundraising by, my aunts and uncles who got a letter from me. They sent me $50. I bought a printer. You might be familiar with that. And then managed to get some individuals who had a little more money. Managed to start meeting people in foundations. Talked to people in foundations. It takes a lot of talking, I think, before you get your first real check. Thankfully, I can't even really remember, but I guess Bank of America was our first one. It was a kind of one-time deal, and I had some connections there in terms of them knowing a little bit about me. So I think that helped. That unfortunately helps. I was reading a little bit in your syllabus about the kind of market forces, and clearly, like knowing someone who knows someone or trying to meet someone is like pretty key in the fundraising process. So luckily that happened, and then we had Blue Ridge, and we had Altria Group, which was Philip Morris, trying to put a good name on their selves, and we were helping them pay their debt to society. And so they actually were a fabulous funder. I am very sad that they no longer exist because they went back. They decided they paid their debt. They spun off all the non-tobacco. And now it's back to Philip Morris, and they're not funding domestic violence nationally. Internationally, they may be. So I'm very sad to see them go because they were an excellent funder that helped me connect with a lot of different organizations, a lot of different corporations, foundations, and even helped integrate me more into the field of domestic violence and sexual assault services. They're gone. So now, not only do we have, and I knew it, we've been prepared for that, but not only do we lose them, but we also obviously have the current financial climate to deal with. So what we've been doing is, I've looked at our budget many times and seen areas where we can trim without making too much impact on our programs. We'll do things more slowly. I've talked to, most of our current funders, and most of them are saying this year is not going to be the bad one, it's next year. But it looks really bad next year. And they're going to be cutting programs, they're going to be cutting back on who they do fund unless something dramatic happens, which seems unlikely. So I'm very worried, and we're going to have to, that means I'm going to have to cut. And I don't know exactly how it's going to happen, but we'll get through it. We will definitely get through it. There's no question that we will, but I'm not sure how painful it will be to do it.
A lot of talking and a lot of trying to pay attention to people's responses. Like, I think it's very easy to just kind of pitch something and be like, this is my pitch. And instead to actually, I've been doing a lot of listening. So part of how I managed to get the prosecutor to say he's the first in a quarter century of people trying in this country to agree to do something like this. And plenty of super capable people have tried. And some of the Bureau's reputation has been instrumental in that, but some of it was also a really long process of listening. So what are your needs? What are your concerns? And listening seriously and taking that into account. And I think there are similar processes if you have that opportunity with potential funders. So figuring out what their interests are, figuring out what their priorities are, because they're also trying to advance something. For me, growing up without money, having asked for money on trains in order to eat as a kid, fundraising at first was hell. Right? Like, I'm associated with those experiences. I was exhausted. I hated it. It felt disgusting to me. And that's something, there's still elements of that where I'm like, this is so important and you're indifferent and that makes me insane, right? So there's that piece of it. But in doing more and more, when you understand that these foundations in particular are trying to advance particular goals that are meaningful to them, and that the way they do that is by giving you money, so that it's not just a matter of you're asking a favor, but that there's a mutual interest in doing it. That's really shifted some of the dynamic for me. My long-term funding plan to be sustainable is to have steady state and federal money. Because we divert people from incarceration at the scale that we hope to get to, will save $16 million a year in prison costs. So that's a lot in this financial climate. We only save that if we get to a certain threshold, right? So we have to get a certain number of cases in order to save that much. And in order to get that number of cases, we need a certain amount of funding. So there's sort of a chicken and egg thing for us that means that this funding climate at our startup time is particularly challenging, because we need that push to get to scale, at which point we can really readily demonstrate the savings that we accrue for government and leverage that to get long-term support. So a lot of how we're articulating the gain to government is this is a sound alternative to incarceration. It's good for victims, but also it saves money. And our hope is that we can get in early enough before everything goes totally to hell, so that we manage to stay in the budget as a cost savings measure. In terms of not chasing money, it's actually, I've become addicted to a theory of change or logic models, which I've had to do for specific outcomes that are the same sort of, what do you do, what's the immediate result, what's the long-term result, how do you measure it, right? Like that kind of flow. And what's amazing about it is that you have you write proposals in the columns, right? This is the need, this is what we do, these are our outcomes, this is what we measure. And in those models, you get to read them across. And so the first time I did mine, I was like, oh my God, this is going to work, right? So you see this, you're like, oh, I do this activity, and it does lead to that, and it does result in this, and that will measure it, and it's really exciting. And then once in a while, you see a line, and you're like, oh, I don't have an impact associated with this activity. And so you're like, okay, does this activity just support another thing? Do I need to be articulating an impact of it? Is it really a subset of something else? Or am I committed to an impact that doesn't have a corresponding activity? And so one of the things for me, and look, when I see funding opportunities, is to go back to that, right? And say, okay, these are the impacts. Do the activities I would have to do for this funding actually generate those impacts, or don't they? Or do the activities I know I'm doing generate the kind of impacts that this funding source is interested in? And if not, I can't do them, because that's the kind of guidepost. And so it becomes a really useful tool for me in understanding, because sometimes you're like, actually, our activities do it. So we've been moving more and more into the public health funding world, which is not an obvious fit for a criminal justice program in some ways, but more and more of the health funders are recognizing violence as a really key public health issue. The mental health outcomes for the victims of crime are something very close to their hearts. So we've been getting a better and better response for the health field, who are also accustomed to handing out bigger chunks of money because they're used to supporting ridiculous hospital costs and scientific research and all sorts of things that are very, very costly. And so we've been getting a level of interest and enthusiasm there that we weren't even encountering from some of the major criminal justice funders. And that's partly one of the things that a solid theory of change has helped us unearth.